thank you very much for coming this evening. I'm Amy Freed from the Department of Political Science at the University of Maine, and I've been working with a wonderful group of people from the Public Library, from the League of Women Voters of Maine, from the Margaret Chase Smith Center, and from the Scholar Strategy Network, the Maine chapter of the Scholar Strategy Network. And there's been just a wonderful array of people. I'm not going to name everyone, so I forget some name or another, but it's just been a wonderful experience working with them to bring Shauna here, who is going on tomorrow to other parts of Maine. She'll be speaking to USM in the evening, next evening, and also visiting Bates. So it's just a lovely tour of Maine that we have her for. And I'm sure you're going to enjoy hearing from Shauna tonight and talking about closing the great political divide. She's a professor of political science at Rutgers in Camden, and is already a rather prolific author with
she's a tired old
tired but prolific author, or prolific but tired author, with a number of different books about women as political candidates, millennials and politics, and also a forthcoming book on dystopian states and fiction. So, all kinds of wonderful research. And I really enjoyed getting to know her more on this trip. And please welcome Shauna.
Thank you all so much. What an enormous pleasure to be here. It's not a part of the country that I've had the opportunity to know well, and Amy's been showing me around all the natural and built landmarks, but I especially loved getting to meet Mary and see the Margaret Chase Smith Center earlier today at the university. What a great set of resources and kind of opportunities for students. I'm jealous for my students of the opportunities there. I'm so thrilled also to be speaking here for the League of Women Voters, one of my all-time favorite organizations. It's the kind of people that I think used to be called sensible women in sensible shoes, which I deeply appreciate. And right, so I wore my sensible shoes today, which I've learned you have to up here. So I'm very excited to tell you a little bit about my research and try to bring it into kind of the state of women in politics, and particularly as candidates. It's a really exciting time, I think, to study and think about women in politics, because we're caught at this crossroads, caught between the need and the desire for more women's voices in the public sphere, but also an increased understanding of the barriers and the backlash and the difficulties that face women who step forward and who speak up. I think often about Virginia Woolf as my guide in all things feminism. And she, in 1937, mind you, imagined women on a bridge, she thought, poised midway between the private house and the public house. And I think we're still caught there in a lot of ways, and we haven't figured out the structural changes that we need to make to fully include women and women's voices and vision, so that we're not getting the benefit of as much diversity in our public institutions as I think we need. A lot of the research in political science has taken an approach that I'm not sure I like, though, because it said women just need to be more confident, or women need to lean in more, right, if you take the business approach. So my research diverges a little bit. I'll tell you in a minute more about what I found, but I tend to find that there's really rational reasons why a lot of women don't run. And I think that's important to know so that we can fix them, but also to honor that it's not just women lacking confidence. I think women are highly cognizant of the barriers. So I'll try to be optimistic for all you all, but the barriers are very real. A little bit about me. I come from a feminist activist background, particularly through the National Organization for Women, where I used to work, and I was on the board for a while. I worked at the national office. This research came out of my dissertation, which I worked very diligently on, you can see. And that was the amount of candy that it took to finish the dissertation, which was a lot. And these are my dissertation advisors, and I wanted to give great credit to Jane Mansbridge and Claudine Gay for their help with this. The dissertation eventually became the book that I'm speaking about. It's called Out of the Running, Why Millennials Reject Political Careers and Why It Matters, available for a paltry sum from NYU Press. It's more than a paltry sum, I'm sorry. I didn't get to decide that. But it came out this past January. And I'll tell you a little bit about what I did and also try and put it in kind of some kind of hopefully not academic boring context. So what I did is called the Law and Policy School Political Ambition Study. So this is the research that I'm basing my conclusions on. In particular, I was interested in this question of why more women and people of color don't want to run for office. And I studied that by looking at the schools that are most likely to send graduates into politics. So I looked at Harvard Law School, Harvard Kennedy School, and Suffolk Law School. So I collected the sample of young people who were kind of at the institutions most likely to be feeders into where I was, the national and the state level politics. And I was particularly interested in running for office because that's one of the most visible gender gaps that we still have in political participation. It's not in voting, it's not in volunteering, a little bit in donating, because men still have access to wealth more than women do. Right? Again, back to Virginia Woolf, why have men always been so rich and women so poor? Right? There's still a wealth disparity by both race and gender. So one of the biggest gaps is donating large sums of money. But running, where much of the power kind of to make the decisions actually lies, is one of the largest gender gaps. And as they'll tell you in Washington, D.C., if you are not at the table, you're on the menu. Therefore, I became fascinated with this question of running for office. I was at these schools, I collected about 800 surveys, and I did 53 one-hour in-depth interviews with people who could be good political candidates. And I wanted to know, would they be interested in running and why or why not? And sometimes more largely, what did they think of politics, or how did they define politics, and what kind of barriers did they see? So here's a story from my research. I often asked the students I was interviewing, do you happen to know what the current percentage of women or minorities in Congress is? And there was a white male law student at Suffolk who often people don't want to tell me that they don't know, right? So what he said was, well, I don't know, but I know it's not where it should be. And that intrigued me. So I said, great, where should it be? And he had this wonderful answer. He kind of thought about it for a second. He goes, let's put it this way. It'd be really great if I could walk into a room of my elected officials and not have the first thought in my head be, whoa, that's a lot of white dudes. So by his proposed test, we are currently failing. So to give you a sense of the current proportions just of women as a whole now, in the House of Representatives, this is about 2 years old, but it's only incrementally changed. House of Representatives is closer to 20% women now. The Senate is also 20%. If you look at it over time, the disparities even more evident, right? So this is kind of historical male domination of elected office position over time. And, if you compare this to women are 51% of the population, it's this rather stark and unfortunate unrepresentation. Let's see, the US Congress currently ranks 99th in the world, according to the Interparliamentary Union, in terms of our place in the world in women's representation. So 98 other countries in the world, most of them, by the way, that we would consider ourselves like vastly superior to, are doing far better than we are in terms of women represented in the lower house of the national legislature. We're at about 12% big city mayors for women, 12% governors, about a quarter of women as state legislators. So around a fifth or sixth of political leaders overall. Just as a note, when we set up new governments and we set up new democracies, we often require that they have a greater proportion of women in their national legislatures than we ourselves have. Time alone is not solving the problem, although there are incremental increases. The there have also been years, in 2010, for example, was the first year we lost women in the state legislatures. So there are kinds of some gains and some reversals. I think a lot about some research I read a while ago now, but it was from Virginia Slims, which does actually some of the best research on women, because that's their target clientele. Virginia Slims had done some research going back to the 1950s, and they asked women, when do you think we're going to see a woman president? And since the 1950s, every decade, women have said, oh, in about 20 years. Right? So it suggests to me that it's an expectation that people in the country have that it will happen, but we're not there yet, right? Which I think we're getting maybe closer than the next 20 years. We had kind of something of a breakthrough, but also something of a backlash this last election. So I hardly need to tell you all, and yet sometimes it's useful to encapsulate the reasons why we care. So if it's useful, feel free to outright steal these. These are the reasons that I have put together about why we want to have more women in office. And there's 5 major ones that I've kind of come across or distilled from the literature. And these are both intrinsic and instrumental, right? And the intrinsic one to me is the most important, but in debate it's often the least effective. Make of that what you will. The intrinsic reason is just simple justice. The idea that 51% of the population and about 20% of elected leadership does not match up, and that you get, right, so it's just simple justice would be that is wrong. Instrumentally, you can often get more results, you get more people to care by talking about there's also policy implications, right, for why you would want to have more women in office. So it turns out women in office often are more productive and by a lot of measures are more effective as legislators than men. They tend to keep in touch with their constituents better. They tend to sponsor and co-sponsor more legislation. If you care about civility, there's often kind of better, or at least more attempts at bipartisanship. Policy implications, the policies that affect women specifically, you often don't get attention to until women are in the legislature. So domestic violence, now we're seeing Me Too and sexual harassment, reproductive rights and job and pay discrimination, work-family balance. These are issues that are often, or for a very long time, have been considered a private sphere issue and the legislature would not address until we got more women in politics. One of my favorite examples is that the very early breast cancer research was actually done on men, right? That the National Institutes of Health would do, which you would use men only for studies for a very long time because it just held one more variable constant. But it was a ridiculous thing to do this research on women, and it was women in the legislature who finally pointed this out. My old boss at the White House Project, where I first worked after college, used to say, women in politics make a better world for everyone. So simple justice, but also policy implications. It turns out there's also implications for people's relationship with their government. So trust in government, efficacy, which is the feeling that you can affect what the government does. Other women's and girls' political participation often increases when you have a woman serving as an elected official. So there's positive implications for the relationship with government. And then there's a role model argument, right? This idea of, I think Marian Wright Edelman used to say, you can't be what you can't see. So the idea that we're in something of a negative feedback cycle right now where you don't see a lot of women in office and it does not inspire as much political ambition in the next generation. And what we'd want to get into is a more virtuous cycle. I think you guys are doing quite well in Maine, though, so you might be in that virtuous cycle. And the last reason goes back to my favorite, Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf wrote in A Room of One's Own about Shakespeare's sister. She said, imagine if William had had a sister as brilliant and as important for humanity as he was. She calls Shakespeare's sister Judith. And now imagine, she says, that Judith Shakespeare left home at 16 to pursue a career on the London stage, right? Judith Shakespeare does not meet a very happy end, unfortunately. The danger that Judith Shakespeare faced is that women's lives are still structured around their gender and their vulnerability so much more than men. And it means that we're losing some incredible talent, right? And it's talent we need for the world. So the conclusion is we need more women in politics for lots of reasons, to help women, but also men and children, elderly, to help communities, to make the world a better place generally. But it's not so simple as throwing a lot of candidates against a bunch of really hard walls. The more we look at this as activists, but also as academics, the more we understand really logical reasons why women might opt out, might not run. The problems are systemic, the gender system or the racial system, the economic system, but the consequences fall hard on the shoulders of the individual women who would run. So I was particularly interested in my study in this question of political ambition, by which we usually mean, do people want to run for office? Or the way I think about it is, do you run toward politics or screaming in the opposite direction? And my research found, not surprisingly, as other people have found, that women have lower levels of political ambition. They just seem less likely to want to run. So this is the data that I found. And you have to imagine here, this is the most ambitious young people in the country from those political theater institutions I showed you before. And I asked them, have you considered running for office, not including school government, but have you considered running for public office? So the orange here is the men, the red is the women, and this is within, I separated by racial groups to be able to look at this differently. Have you thought seriously of running? Overall, only about 15% of this sample had thought seriously of running. And there were these massive and statistically very significant gender differences, even at the schools where people would be most likely to run. And if you ask all of these people, would you consider yourself ambitious? 95% of every group, of every race and every gender who said, yes, I'm ambitious, right? So it's something about political ambition specifically. What it says to me, though, because I don't believe, as I said, I don't believe women lack ambition by any means. So what it says to me is that women on the whole are more strategic about what the barriers are and more sensitive to them often. So what are the barriers? The biggest barriers to more women running, I think, are structural rather than psychological. And in particular, incumbency often acts as the biggest barrier. So Palmer and Simon call incumbency the glass ceiling for women in politics. Although Laura Liswood, who founded the Council of Women World Leaders, a wonderful organization. She tells me often she doesn't like the term glass ceiling. She says, I think it's just a thick layer of men. And she's right. Also, structurally, there's the way that we structure private care work is still gendered in a way that it makes it harder for women to do public as well as private work. As Catherine McKinnon likes to say, women bear and often raise the children for everyone. And that's not limited to politics, but it's one of the structural factors, I think, that continue to keep us from gender equality. It may be worse in politics because of the travel and the long hours involved, so that might exacerbate it. Often it means that women enter politics later in life than men do, and it can limit sometimes their ability to move up. There's discrimination in terms of funding and media. Media often focus on what Marie Wilson calls hair, hemlines, and husbands. So some new research has found that calling that out directly, if women have are treated with a double standard in the media, the more that you can say that and say directly to the media sources, calling the woman this or talking about her clothing in a way that you wouldn't for the men makes people think less of her policy. If you can just say directly, this is what you're doing. It's called Name It, Change It is the campaign. Let's see. There's a recruitment gap structurally, so that women, we find in the research, women often need more encouragement and need to be told to run more often but get less, right? So there's a recruitment gap, and lastly, there's this long-standing barrier that academics like to call gender role incongruity, which, it's a wonderful academic term, but put in simple language, it's the idea that the way that we construct gender roles is in Congress. It is not really compatible with women being leaders, or especially political leaders. So I heard Rosa DeLauro is a House member from Connecticut one time. And she said, my God, if you can lead and if you can yell at people and, if you do all these things that would win men praise for being assertive, my God, she said, are you really still a woman? It was a gender role incongruity. The way that we construct the gender role of femininity is often about the lack of power rather than about being powerful or decisive. What I found in my research is that those things, as well as some new and some increasing costs, seem to keep a lot of people, not just women, but a lot of people from running, and they may weigh on women more. So things like the role of money in campaigns. We have found in our research now that women can indeed raise as much money as men, right? So the idea that women are unable to be viable candidates is completely wrong. But it takes more work, and women often raise it in smaller dollar donations. So you have to be willing to often work a little harder. Increasing use of social media, right? I think women are often held to a higher standard and know that they will be judged often unfairly, so that the idea that anything you say and do will be reported and that everybody's watching you at all times. It's a cost that probably weighs heavily on all people, but more on women than on men. The fear that that scrutiny would also affect somebody's family, right? The idea that there would be privacy invasion. Everybody I talked to was afraid of that, men as well as women, men especially for their children or future children. Also knew the kind of, not necessarily new, but growing in the last couple of decades, increasing polarization between the parties and decreasing bipartisanship. It leads kind of to, it mostly has eliminated the open seats, which are the best way for women to get in, right? So that it's structurally become even harder. So this seems to exacerbate all of the trends that hinder women as candidates. And also those previous structural conditions about the wealth and pay gaps between women. Women also have less of their own money often to invest in campaigns, which is becoming a critical way that many men get their start in politics. All of it mean that I think we are driving good people in general away from political candidacy, but more women than men. I call this candidate deterrence, the idea that good people would be deterred from seeking office. I have some wonderful qualitative data for you all here. This is from the interviews that I did. Here are two young people's views of money in politics. So Jasmine told me that she thought of politics as a necessary evil or unrealized potential, and that people in politics aren't courageous enough. She says, who has a politician's ear? People with money, all right? And there were at least two different aspects, maybe more, of the role of money in modern campaigns that seemed to kind of deter the young people I was talking to. One of them was having to ask for the money, right? And there was a kind of a revulsion about the idea. I think for women more than men, a lot of the men I talked to weren't as deterred and said, well, this is the game. This is how it's played. I don't know if it has to do with the historical lack of access to wealth or property, or if it's, just kind of, an accident that I saw this in the interviews, but the women were more deterred. I had one young woman who was at Harvard Law tell me, she couldn't even bear to take $40 from her parents when she was getting back on the bus to go to school, and they tried to get, she didn't want to be asking her parents for anything. And she couldn't imagine spending most of her time asking people for money. But the other side of it was then even if you asked, and you could bring yourself to ask, you'd have to accept it. And I called that in the book the ick factor. They felt icky about taking the money, not even just asking for it, but taking it, these young people often felt would imply some quid pro quo. It might imply that they were promising to do something. It might compromise them. I think it's a tremendous detriment to our political system that this is how we fund campaigns. I should have made a slide of it, I didn't, but in my book I have a whole chart about how other advanced post-industrial democracies fund their campaigns. Nobody does it like we do. It's a terrible system. Mostly it's parties or the government will actually pay for the campaigns, and you have strict spending limits, right, that you all have to work within, which I think would equalize campaigns tremendously, and also would kind of stop some of this terrible deterrence of good young people. Dave was even more what shall we say, verbose. Dave was at Harvard, can you tell? He had this large vocabulary, and I swear, he said directly, I said, would you ever run for office? He was at the Kennedy School, Dave, so I thought he might want to run for office. No, he wanted to do like union organizing. He really wanted to do grassroots work, and he said, I would risk capture going into a political process as corrupted and sclerotic and generally putrescent as the American one. So full of money, really, that it ends up attracting people who understand that and don't care, or the few silly idealistic ones who think they can change the system from within. It's like a knife in the heart for a political scientist, right? You know, I was not allowed in the research to point out things to the interviewers. I was just trying to extract information from them. But I can point out to you, right, the only way to change this system is from within. Dave. So what I ended up with is this three-part argument about candidate deterrence, that it affects everyone, and I'd say, you know, 90%, 85 to 90% of the young people that I talked to who were already in some form of policy or law program, so they'd made a decision in their lives to pursue this, really did not want to run for office. And I think that's a shame. I think we're losing good talent. It affects women more than men, though, for lots of reasons, particularly because there are more and sometimes different costs for women than for men. And most of all, it affects women of color. So women of color face racial as well as gender costs. So one of the biggest gender differences I found in the research, which I thought certainly contributed to candidate deterrence, has to do with, and in this it would be more of the rewards rather than the costs, right? So if the costs are high, you really need the rewards to be higher to balance it out, to make running rational. I asked this question, it was a series of agree, disagree items. And the question was, do you agree or disagree, and how strongly? So the statement was, the problems I most care about can be solved through politics. So within each racial group, this is the percent agree. That aggregates agree and agree strongly. And the Hispanic men, by the way, that's a small sample, is the reason that's more variable than the others. Hispanic men were the least well represented at these schools. So I think there's only maybe 20 people in that bar, whereas I had a couple hundred in the white bar. So the differences in every racial group are statistically significant. And in particular, overall, what it means is about half of men, a little less, so it's still a minority of people overall, but almost half of men thought that politics can solve important problems. But it was only about a third of women who believed that. And it makes me concerned about the future of women running for office, because if only kind of a minority of women believe that politics can solve problems, they may not see that the rewards are high enough to counterbalance these very high costs. There was also this idea of, as a cost, that you would face an unequal, gendered discrimination by the media. So this question was, I was doing this research in 2010 to 2012, so it was before Hillary ran for president in 2016, but she had run in the Democratic primary 2008. So the question here is, do you agree or disagree? Hillary Clinton was treated fairly by the news media. And I wanted to frame that in the positive to see if people disagreed, rather than just let people, kind of show people what I'm asking. The interesting thing here, nobody believed that to be true. So they, I think, correctly perceived a gendered, discriminatory news environment for women. But within the nobody perceiving that to be true, at least the minority of people perceiving that to be true, it was highly gendered, that women far more than men saw discrimination. And particularly I thought that was interesting, the black women were highly sensitive to discrimination faced by Hillary Clinton. So nobody likes to play a game when the deck is stacked against you, right? So this, you could easily see this as a cost, as a reason not to want to enter politics. I was also interested in the question, I'm sorry, the program has taken it gives you stars for both women and men. That's women, this is men. Should do squares for one of them. But I was interested in this question of discrimination, and does a previous experience of discrimination then make you expect it in the future? So I split the sample up into kind of these three groups along the bottom. Have you had any experience of discrimination? So no experience, kind of a moderate experience of discrimination, or high experience of discrimination. And what the numbers here show is how much discrimination you expect in the future. So based on what you have experienced, does it in a way teach you to then anticipate and expect that you will face more discrimination? Those people with no experience of discrimination, even the men, almost a full quarter of them thought there would be discrimination in the political environment, right? But the women far more so, even if they hadn't experienced it themselves. The most likely to expect discrimination, though, were women who felt like they'd had a relatively high experience of it themselves. And that's a very high number to have over 80% saying they expected the political environment to be discriminatory.
Is that discrimination against women in particular? Or?
It's a great question. This is an index of factors. So the expectation of discrimination is maybe 10 questions on my survey that I aggregated together, which was the Hillary Clinton question, did you see discrimination in the campaign? Things about, would you expect donors to give as much to women as they would to men? It included some racial discrimination questions also. So the expectation of discrimination was a conglomeration of factors, and these are the average scores of expectation. And those who have experienced it themselves were far more likely to think the world was not fair. And women of color were particularly likely to think this. This was particularly stark. I could give you lots of different examples, but this was a question I had. This is a question that we ask a lot on national surveys, so I just replicated it on my survey. It's an agree, disagree. The item is, you can trust the government to do what's right most of the time. This is a particularly trusting bunch, actually. Right, because these are students who I think to themselves, I'm going to constitute the government at some point. If not through running for office, certainly by being in the lawyer class. 2/3 of this group are lawyers, or going to be. They're in law school. Right now, nationally, and we are in a slightly different era, this was 5 years old, this data, but right now, nationally, it's about 13% agreeing with this statement, so it's very, very low. Among this sample, which was unusually politically participatory, and as you can see, not hugely trusting, but more trusting than the national averages, it was black people in particular, and that's not a significant gender difference, right? So suddenly the gender difference is wiped out, and this was really about race. Did not trust the government to do what's right. Right, I think we're seeing this in Black Lives Matter, particularly right now. This was a question about, was Barack Obama in 2008 treated fairly by the news media? More people believed that than believed that Hillary had been treated fairly. But still, except for, the men were kind of more, interestingly saw less discrimination, even the men of color. But still there was this kind of expectation, particularly on the part of women of color, and by white women as well, that there was an unfairness in the media based on race. So I asked Jasmine, I was particularly interested in how race might operate for women of color, and I asked Jasmine, who was a Harvard Law School student, African American, I said, as you go through the world, you kind of expect people will treat you in a different way because of your race or your gender. It's a clumsy question, but I didn't want to signal what I was looking for, and I actually did want to know what she would do with that. And she kind of laughed at me, is what she did. She said, absolutely, I'm not naive to that fact. I don't try to find a racial incident or a gender incident in every interaction. Are there times when I feel like there could be a racial or gender incident? Absolutely. And then I italicize this. It's like the antenna's up enough so that if something happens, it's like, wait a minute, but not so much I'm actually seeking something if the station is clear. But I absolutely feel that out in the world I will deal with people who have stereotypes about people of color or women. Right? It's just the structure of her daily life that she expects this discrimination. And I talked also to, this was a different black female Harvard Law School student, Tamika. I've given them pseudonyms, not their real names, but Tamika in particular talked about feeling wary around white people, and I was interested in that. And I said, do you think that affects your behavior? And she said, yes. And she said, it's kind of hard. You feel like you have, and I could see the emotion, right? That's really, it was very present in her face. She says, it's like you have a weight on your shoulders. And so, like, I feel even as a woman, too, I can sort of let my guard down and be who I actually am when I'm with a group of black people. So I don't know, it definitely changes it. I feel like I have to put on less of a front. I don't have to be like, I'm at Harvard Law School, I'm Tamika Jackson, I'm going to conquer the world. I can just be myself, she said. And it's startling because it reminded me of reading Du Bois, who was at Harvard over 100 years before Tamika, and who also intentionally kind of separated himself from the company of white people and would seek out black people. There weren't others at Harvard at the time, but he would seek out black people in Boston just to be able to be himself with. So the idea of putting yourself, and I think that, it's not that that by itself would stop women of color from seeking office, but the dailiness of maybe that wariness or having to have that antenna up or whatever the costs are, the daily costs of racism or the daily costs of sexism or the daily costs of feeling like the world isn't quite fair, or the idea that you'd like to be around people who understand rather than fighting all the time with people who don't, it could definitely cumulatively, I think, push you away from a political career. And then there's, the non-psychological, the actual material differences, right? Politics is often financially risky or financially a stretch. So this was, let's see, whoops, not there yet. I should have put the question wording. Let me try and remember it exactly. I was interested in, are you expected to have to contribute to your family of origin financially? Right, so once you graduate with your degree, do you have to send money back, not just to the family that you create, but the one that created you, to your parents, to your siblings? And so a minority of the white students and majorities of the particularly black and Asian students felt like they had to do that. I don't quite know why the Asian American women that seemed to affect particularly. And the Hispanic men, I had this interesting kind of data about Hispanic men. There's just so few of them. It's a very self-selected sample from Harvard Law. 3 from Harvard Law and 5 from the Kennedy School. So it's not a really representative sample. But I had there's over 100 black students in this survey, so that's good data. And Asian American women, almost 100. It does let you know there's something going on there about maybe the opportunity cost. Politics often, at least when you're getting started, is an unpaid or low-paid second job, third job, right? For people who are already socioeconomically marginalized, this is going to make it more difficult. It's more of a cost to think about going into that, more risky. And I think people who have the resources are more willing to, of course, take those risks. All right, so that's about where I'm going to stop. I want to make sure I leave time for Q&A. But cumulatively, what I came up with then is that generally, although there are some exceptions and there are wonderful women who do run, overall, what it seems like to me is that we have created a situation in terms of how we structure candidacy where the costs are not outweighed by the perceived rewards, and I call that candidate deterrence. The deck is kind of stacked against women as candidates, and particularly women of color. On the other hand, I said I try to be hopeful. I think this has always been the case in my studies of US history, right? And when I look at the social movements that women have run and created in this country and won, right, it makes me think maybe the most important thing we could do is just make women think that it's worth it. Because I think if you give women good reasons to run, they can do anything. So I remind you of the wise words of Ann Richards, who said, Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did, only backwards and in high heels. The deck may have always been stacked against women, and yet women have done amazing things and overcome far worse odds, right? Even just to get the right to vote. I think about the suffrage movement a lot. So both my research and my experience suggest if women have good reasons to run, if they really believe that politics can solve problems, which right now it seems like the research suggests they don't enough. What if we could change that? If we could give, if women have a good reason, I think they can and will do anything. And that's, I think our future depends on that. So I'll stop there. I'd love your questions and comments, and thank you all. All right, did we get a room mic? No, I think I'm supposed to repeat the question. So you go ahead and then I'll try and repeat it for the mic.
Your control groups, what is it like for women going to law, into medicine, into banking and business? You know, there's similar patterns there, number one. And number two, are you just referring to government in Washington? Is there not a difference between state and then local?
Yes. Let me take that. There are two questions. The first one is there a difference between different levels and types of government? And then the second question about would it be different if I had studied women going into different fields, maybe? So let me take that levels of government question first, because I actually do have data on that. And I don't have a slide on it, but I'll try and describe it. There's a fairly stark kind of curve with young people being much more interested in state and local office and being the least interested right now in running for federal office, and largely because of, I think, the costs seem higher and the rewards seem lower at the federal level right now. But a lot of young people seem to really think you could get more done and maybe stay more connected to your constituents if you were mayor of a town, if you were on the city council, if you ran for the state legislature. So it was almost a direct correlation of like the more local, the more people were interested in. And if you go far enough, kind of down to the nitty-gritty local, the gender gap completely disappears, right? There's no gender gap for women and men on school boards, for example. But right, as soon as you hit city council, the gender gap starts appearing. I do think, and I'm excited actually by the data that I got on the local and that interest and that kind of greater ambition for that, because to me that's the heart of politics. And I think if you start there, that's where young people could see, oh, you can make a difference, right? And that's where the ambition to run for higher office can come from. As long as we can convince them, as long as they don't start at the local and then become so disenchanted and disillusioned with this broken system and think, this is terrible, I'm going to go do something else. It's a real danger right now. About the second part of the question, I didn't study women in medicine or business schools. I'd love to. This was an incredibly expensive research endeavor to do. I mean, this was, I got various grants, but it was probably $20,000. Just to do this research on the law and policy schools. I'd love to, at some point, figure out, I think it would be great to get more doctors and nurses into politics, to get people who are not lawyers, to get representation from a wider variety of people, engineers, right? We don't have enough scientists, I think, in politics. So that would be great, but I don't have data on that.
My question was actually a little different, though.
Okay.
Is there a similar disbalance, a poor balance?
Oh, of women going into,
women going
good question.
Profession X, Y, Z.
Yes, that's a good question. So there's a big imbalance in STEM, especially science, technology, engineering. In terms of medicine, no, I think women are half of medical students now. In terms of women in business, the numbers crept up. I think it's more like women are 35 to 40% of students in business school now. For those professions, not so much doctors anymore even, but particularly women in business, the problem seems to be kind of mid-career, that women hit these various barriers. Still some work family, a lot of sexism and sexual harassment in the workplace, maybe inability to move up in corporations and leave the business world more. So it's not going into as much anymore, as we call it, the leaking pipeline. But yeah, there's some really good research on that. Other questions? Yes,
Your
please.
subtitle said millennials, but you did not define, when you were talking about the samples,
Yes.
who they were as far as their age.
Right, it's a good question. Generally, millennials are those, in my sample, born between like 1980 and 1995. Right, so depending on how you define it, it's our largest living generation, right? They can be larger than the baby boomers.
We're in these schools.
Exactly, right. Did you ask that for a particular reason?
Oh, because I'm a scientist, so I like to know what.
How you define the variables?
That's
right.
And then you didn't mention it again, so.
It's true. I should.
For primary, a writer, you have to be internally consistent.
Excellent.
And I guess the other thing that we know is that women, when they do run, as you mentioned, tend to run after their children are,
Correct.
Nancy Pelosi said, I waited until my kids were teenagers
That's right.
before I ran.
Yeah.
And so perhaps, and I'm a scientist and
Yes.
I'm also published now, and there are very few, not in Maine, Maine state legislature actually has more people who are trained in science
Great.
than other state
Yeah.
legislatures. But in general, when you look across what the higher education is of people in, say, the federal, in Congress, U.S. Congress,
That's very
they're
low.
lawyers.
Yeah.
They're lawyers.
Yes.
And the PhDs, they're economists.
That's right.
And there are a couple of doctors, but
We have
basically,
one political scientist, right?
and yet they're making decisions about all of what
Yes.
America is. And all
Yes.
of America is not all lawyers.
That's right.
Not even 85% lawyers.
That's right.
And so
It is not quite 85%, but of the people who have degrees, law is by far the most prevalent. But there's a lot of people who don't have advanced degrees also.
it's wonderful to get this information.
Yeah.
And what we need to look is at women who are, say, in their 40s.
Yes.
Because we now have in America, we will change their profession regularly.
Yes.
Whereas at least my parents, they were in one profession.
Right.
I
mean, I
was
love it.
two, one before kids and one after kids, but that's
Sure.
two professions. The woman's in her 80s, she's still in her second profession.
Right.
And that's not the new America.
No.
We change careers often, and so we actually now have a system of the way people work that they would be changing careers, so why not change to this career? So then it's not just millennials that the women that we would like to see and people of color would like to see
Right.
could be coming from other demographics other than millennials.
I think actually there's far more serious underrepresentations even than we've talked about. I think class is the largest underrepresentation, right? That this is an incredibly wealthy Congress, and we're kind of losing wealth for most people in this country right now. So it's incredibly unrepresentative in that way. And as you know, as a scientist, one of the hardest things is to just hold variables constant. In some ways, I made decisions in this research about, I want to study race and I want to study gender and I want it not to be kind of really driven by class. Right, so therefore Harvard Law School, it made a lot of sense, but it also means I can't touch at all one of the most serious underrepresentations. I mean, I'd love to see working class people, right, get elected because that's, such a serious group that needs something different from government often. So, yeah, everything you said is totally right. Sir?
So one of my favorite women is Emma Goldman. And she was opposed to women getting the vote.
Yes,
And
a radical.
And I think her primary reasoning was that if women get into politics, they'll become more like men.
Yes.
And,
That's
and
right.
I think you see, Margaret Thatcher, Hillary Clinton on defense, Collins on defense. You see a lot of that.
You do.
So what do you think of that?
So the question is, was Emma Goldman correct in fearing that if women got into politics, they would conform to the prevailing male or patriarchal model, particularly on defense, and become more hawkish? Generally, if you look at, say, women as heads of state, that is absolutely true, right? The first woman to be the head of state of any country seems to have a need to prove herself, and often is more hawkish. And so Margaret Thatcher, Indira Gandhi, Golda Meir, right? There's some excellent examples to show you are right there. On the other hand, there's also the suggestion, the hope maybe, from the research that that's what happens when you have a single woman who gets into a completely male-dominated area by herself, right? So that what she has to do is prove she's as good as the boys. And if instead you could get a critical mass of women who come in maybe together, a cohort that could support each other and try to change the institution rather than just prove they can do it. I think the hope is you don't have to then just conform to a prevailing patriarchal model. I'm not sure that's always true. Right? It depends how strong the institutional model is. There are some women actually who are tougher than most men, so right, that might be who's attracted to run for those positions. On the whole, though, if you look at Amy teaches public opinion, right? I teach public opinion. If you look at women's public opinion versus men overall, right, women tend to be less hawkish. Women tend to support things that would lead to peace or negotiation far more than war. Big gender gaps on gun control and other violence issues. The hope for me then is if you got enough women in that were representative of women as a group and not just the most hawkish, that you would not prove Emma Goldman correct. But while we have such strong patriarchal norms, it may be that women cannot get in until they meet some bar. So, again, poised on that bridge right now. Oh wait, let's have somebody new ask a question in the back here.
Hi. Hi. Thank you for your talk. That was great.
Sure.
Would you happen to have any information about the number of women running for office in upcoming elections, November of 2018?
Yes.
And how some of these groups like Emily's List or Emerge that we have here in Maine have impacted the amount of women running for office?
Wonderful question. Are you by any chance affiliated with such
I am.
group?
I am an Emerge candidate.
Yay! I love Emerge. So the question is, Shauna, you have written a whole book that says why women don't run for office, and now we are suddenly seeing more women run for office than ever before. How do you square that circle? Excellent question. The interesting thing, I don't actually have the numbers, but I have some estimates. So I've been studying actually Emerge America at the national level. Emerge America is a Democratic women's training program, candidate training and recruitment program, and they do excellent work. What I've heard from the national level Emerge folks who hear from their state level chapters, and there's something like 24 chapters right now, and they're adding new ones all the time, is that the interest in Emerge trainings has doubled and in some states tripled since the 2016 elections. So I heard from a friend who works for Emily's List that right after the 2016 election, so like as of December of 2016, they had something like 30,000 women sign up through Emily's List to be candidates. And they didn't at the time have an online candidate training program, and I had to kind of get one set up right quick. But as far as we can tell, this will be a record-breaking year in terms of women running for office. At all kinds of levels, it looks like, and I'm so glad that you're running here. It's hard to tell still because a lot of the filing deadlines have not passed. We don't have the exact numbers. But it looks like a lot of millennial women. And it looks like a lot of women of color, which is so great, and it's so not exactly what I said in my book. So Republican women are a different story. So let me explain the other things first, and I'll go back. I've also just co-edited a book on Republican women specifically. actually, maybe I'll start there. Republican women face an additional set of hurdles, which are unique to them, and I think actually make it much harder for Republican women to run than Democratic women. So what we found in the research for the Republican Women book, which is called The Right Women, and it's out through Prager Press as of last month, but it's a bunch of studies about Republican women specifically and the kind of the party culture, party ideology, the funding sources. And in particular, there's two major problems that I think Republican women face that Democratic women don't, which is particularly on the Republican side, somewhat on the Democratic side, but what's been happening in terms of party primaries in the last decade, or especially since 2010, is that on the Republican side you have this institution, the Tea Party, which is, we have kind of more progressive groups within the Democratic Party that pull to the left there, but not as hard. The Tea Party has particularly focused on primaries as its method of kind of systematically eliminating Republican moderates. And there were more moderate Republican women, particularly in the House, and that was so important to get to kind of getting these bipartisan women's bills and policy to work. The Republican moderate women have been systematically eliminated through the kind of strategic use of primaries. And if you listen to the Tea Party, right, they'll talk about using primaries as a verb, right? We're going to primary that candidate. Like drum them out of existence because they're not conservative enough. In a primary, what you have is generally about a third of the party. Only about a third of the possible voters vote, and they tend to be the ones farthest to the right in the Republican. So that the far more extreme candidate is the one who gets nominated. You do have some women still running and winning through that because they are extreme right candidates, but because of the kind of trends of public opinion, there are fewer far right Republican conservatives who are women than who are men. And the party as a whole moving further to the right has left a whole lot of women not feeling like the party's their home anymore. Christine Todd Whitman from my current state of New Jersey has a wonderful book. She wrote mid-90s called It's My Party Too, right? And she was one of these rare kind of pro-choice Republicans, but her breed is gone. It's not her party too anymore, really. No. All right, so you've got primaries on the one hand for Republican women as a mechanism of kind of as a real barrier unless you're hyper-conservative. But the other thing that you have is an inability to raise money in the same way Democratic women do. So in particular, on the Democratic side, you can use gender and the idea of needing more women in politics, and the idea that diversity is a good thing, right? That's a reason to get people to give money to your campaign, or to get PACs, Emily's List especially. But other PACs will invest in your campaign because you're a woman and we need more women in politics. And that's anathema to the Republican ideology of kind of rugged individualism, that each person is an individual, and that the idea of group-based identity is counter to the kind of party belief and culture. That's the opposition to identity politics. So it's a much more narrower space for Republican women within which they can kind of operate and raise money. And it is mostly kind of women's PACs and Emily's List that have helped even out the gender gap in fundraising in the last 20 years. So if you don't have that on the Republican side, and you can see in the data, Republican women often raise less money, even though I think as candidates they're often higher quality, as in they've held political office before, but they're not as able to raise the money. So the money together with the primaries seems to be squeezing Republican women. You just see a lot fewer of them as candidates. I think I'm not part of that party, but I was interested in doing this book on the right women because I just think that's an essential component of a feminist movement, that you can't have a movement that is only based in one party. So I think it's a great tragedy that we're losing more Republican women and that the barriers are higher for them. And now I have totally forgotten your other question. That was the question. I feel like there was another piece to it. Maybe somebody else will bring it up.
The other piece to it, is there a Republican equivalent to Emily's List?
There is not. That's a great question. There's little smaller PACs, right, that try to, and every once in a while the Republican Party will try to kind of start its own support women, right? They had grow within the Republican Party recently, but none of them, let's see, there's the Right Women Right Now PAC, which does some great work in recruiting and training and raising money. None of the Republican women's organizations are anywhere near as powerful or well-funded as Emily's List, though. And like there was a study in the book recently of donors to both the Republican and the Democratic parties. And 90-something% of Democratic Party donors had heard of Emily's List, and only 20% or less of the Republican Party donors knew about any of these women's PACs, right? So the visibility is far lower. The kind of scope and capacity of them is nowhere near Emily's List. It's a huge imbalance. Yes, Mary?
There used to be an organization called Wish List.
The Wish List.
Supported pro-choice.
It was a great organization. It folded.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And Karen Ray, who owns Ray's Mustard in Eastport, Maine,
Okay.
was the director for that.
Right, and Candy Strait, who I met in DC a couple times. Yeah.
Well, I raised quite a bit of money, but never as much money for Republican pro-choice women as, of course, Emily's List.
Right.
But
Yeah.
it's just a shame that, I guess, and you know so much more, but was it the Tea Party movement that kind of pushed out the Republican?
So the question is, what happened to Wish List, which was the Republican equivalent for a long time in DC of Emily's List. Honestly, I think it was that the parties, it was before the Tea Party, and I think it was the divergence on abortion, because it was only for pro-choice Republican candidates, and those became fewer and fewer. Yeah, that's my understanding, but I thought it was a terrific organization. I was sorry to see it go. So, am I getting a time signal? Maybe one more question.
I'm wondering how you think your results would generalize to individuals that don't identify within the binary, like transgender,
Oh, such a great
non-binary, gender queer individuals.
Yes.
I know you didn't sample those individuals.
I didn't. Do you know what they came up anyway, though? Because they are very eager to tell you about their gender on surveys. They will tell you you're asking the question wrong. So I did have a few, but not enough to like generalize from. But what I did was make sure to leave space. Like I always said, is there something else that might make you not want to run? And so a lot of people would kind of say that directly in their own words. I didn't code it and I didn't do it quantitatively. Excuse me, but I had, for example, this is not gender identity so much as sexual orientation, right? But I had some people say, well, I come from a conservative area and I'm gay or I'm bi, and I don't think they'd accept that. So I would assume, particularly trans is still kind of a conflicted identity, I would assume that some people would feel that way, and it might add to candidate deterrence. I'm hoping we're going to get soon some examples that are going to counter that, right? So we have several lesbians and gay men examples that you can say, well, they can do it and still get elected. And then recently, Jordan at lunch today said he's from Oklahoma. In both Oklahoma and Texas, openly trans people have been elected. And I think it's a wonderful example. You can say, of course there's still discrimination, but maybe it's not as bad as you think. Because even here in Texas, it's a trans woman I think was elected sheriff. That's a tough position, right? So that's a fairly good example that although there is discrimination, maybe it's not as bad as we fear. I remember the last piece of the question that I haven't yet addressed, so I'll just end on that. The question is, why would so many women be suddenly wanting to run if I'm correct about this candidate deterrence thing? And they are, so either I'm wrong or something's missing from the theory. And I think that's what it is. I've been thinking about this a lot. Don't worry, it still fits. No, but I think something's missing. And in particular, I think I underestimated or didn't have to include, because we weren't thinking about it at the time, a whole lot of the rewards of politics that I didn't think to measure. So the rewards of living in a democracy. Yeah. Turns out that can go away, right? So as we're seeing kind of rising populism across the world and constriction of democratic processes, I think people, young people especially, are very aware of some dangers that they see in this country. And that kind of reward can heavily factor into wanting to make people run. A lot of the women who seem to be coming out of the woodwork to want to run for office in 2018 are doing so, I think, in direct either opposition to the current government, or in kind of this new phase of the feminist movement, the Me Too movement, kind of motivated by ideas of kind of understanding that if women don't speak up and if women don't control things, life may not be what you want it to be, right? It turns out your rights sometimes can go away. So I think those potential rewards are suddenly so much more visible to a lot of these women who are thinking, oh, if I don't run, my life could change in a way I don't like, right? That's an autonomy question even. Anyway, these were things I didn't measure, but now I'm excited to think about how they might factor into the rewards. Because unfortunately, as far as I can tell, the costs of running for office are going to stay high for a while, right? We're not going to publicly fund campaigns. I know you have tried here in Maine. That's wonderful.
Here in Maine.
Yeah. Did the Supreme Court knock down? Oh, they did in Arizona.
63% of candidates for a legislature will.
That's so great.
this year.
Yeah.
Maine was the first state to have publicly funded.
Yeah, that I remember. And Arizona had a good program too. And unfortunately, right, there's a, confusion at the Supreme Court about, money as speech. But I'm very glad you can do it here.
I know Amy said we're done, but I have one more question, which is, you mentioned that when we, as a government, put in new countries and we say they have to have certain gender balance or sex.
Well, we usually say, like to the Loya Durga in Afghanistan, you have to have 25% women.
So are there any states or cities in the U.S. that have a quota that says that there have to be a certain number of women?
It's an interesting question. I think, no, we tend to be allergic to quotas in this country. Here's an interesting example, though. We don't have it for public office, and we don't have it for candidates, which other countries sometimes do. They have reserved seats for women, or they have party gender candidate quotas. Like a third of your candidates have to be women, right? We don't do that, largely because the parties don't really control who their candidates are. But at the national conventions, both parties have a 50% quota of delegates, right? So we do have quotas, so you can tell everybody. We actually do have quotas here in the U.S. So maybe we could use that in a better way for, candidate quotas, I think, are how most other countries like us have surpassed us now.
And the other countries have done it by law?
Here, I'll come chat with you. Yeah, it's generally laws. But thank you all so much for being here. Now you get the food.